In this video, I want to discuss the proper use of some of the controller plugins in FL Studio, as they can prove to be very powerful assets in creating some more advanced effects. As we've discussed in the linking tutorial, when linking to a controller, we are simply using input to modulate a control in FL Studio. The first of these controllers is the Fruity Peak controller. The peak controller works by adjusting a linked control based on the input from a signal source. For instance, we can modulate the volume of one sound based on the volume of another sound. The common use for this is to create a ducking or pulsing effect. To do this, we can insert a channel that contains the input that we want to use to modulate the linked channel. For this example, I'll just insert an instance of the Fruity Kick plugin. Then we'll insert another channel, and for this, we'll just use the SimSynth with the default setting. Now we'll put the kick on mixer track 1 and the synth on track 2. I'll draw out 4 beats on the kick and just 1 beat on the synth. Let's listen to where we're at. So you can see that right now everything sounds standard. Now we'll add the peak controller on mixer track 1, which is the kick. We don't need to add anything to track 2, but for this example, to keep it simple, we'll just modulate the volume slider for track 2 so that the volume pulses in time with the kick. We'll right-click on the volume slider of track 2 and select Link to Controller. We'll go down to the internal controllers and select Peak Control Insert 1 Peak. This tells FL Studio to link the volume slider on track 2 to the signal level of track 1. So now, when we play back this example, you'll see the volume slider on track 2 move in time with the kick. Now you won't hear the kick because by default, the track that is doing the modulating is muted. We can unmute this track by selecting Unmute from the Peak Controller window. I'll play the example with the kick muted and unmuted so that you can hear the effect. Now, we can also adjust some settings to get a greater effect. The bass control determines where our bass level is. This means that as we turn the knob to the left, we're turning the bass lower, so that the starting point of the control, in this case our volume slider, is lower. We can turn it to the right to raise the bass level and therefore start off at a higher level. The volume control determines how much the control gets modulated. In this case, it determines how much the volume slider moves up or down. We can set a low bass setting and a high volume setting to get the greatest effect. We also have a tension setting. This will determine the strength of the effect in that it will create tighter and quicker moves with a higher tension setting and more loose moves with a lower setting. You'll also see that we have monitors for the input level, which is controlled ultimately by the channel volume, as well as the output peak level and an LFO peak meter if it's in use. One thing that I've mentioned numerous times over this series of videos is that the channel volume is like a preamp. It determines the input signal's volume. The mixer track will take the input volume and turn it up or down. But the signal that is being used in the peak controller is your input signal, not from the mixer track. This means to get a lesser or greater effect, you can use the channel volume, and as you lower it, the effect becomes lesser because you are lessening the actual signal that the peak meter reads. So even when we turn the mixer track down all the way, you can still hear the effect because the input signal is still coming into the plugin. Otherwise, if we turn down the channel control and leave the mixer track up, the effect will disappear. Below these controls, we also have a section to use an LFO as a modulator. Now, when using the LFO, we don't need to rely on input signal. This is because the controls are going to be modulated by the LFO in the peak controller. To use it, we'll right-click on the Channel 2 volume slider and select Link to Controller. The check mark beside it tells us that a link already exists. Next, we'll select Control Insert 1 LFO from the list. This will then link the volume slider to the LFO portion of the peak controller. Again, we have volume and bass controls as well as tension. Then we have speed and pulse width controls. These will control the oscillation of the low frequency oscillator, or LFO. You can adjust the speed manually by left-clicking and dragging, or you can right-click and select a preset time. This is a fun tool to play with for creating pulsing type sounds or intricate movements that may be too much of a hassle to set up yourself through an automation clip. I'll play the example now and try different LFO settings so that you can hear the effect. You can also choose to have a combination of the peak and the LFO summed together. To do this, just choose it as your linking option from the internal controllers list. The next controller I'd like to discuss is the envelope controller. The envelope controller uses an envelope that you determine to modulate the linked controls. To use it, we actually would insert it into our channel window like you would any other channel, even though it's technically in effect. Once loaded, we'll again link our volume slider from the SimSynth channel. Once the linking panel is open, you'll notice our options are different. We have separate articulators to choose from. For this example, we'll choose number 1 and press accept. Now, an articulator can be looked at as a slot. In slot 1, we can change the settings all around, but slot 2 will remain unaffected. So this means that we can make different envelopes and then link them how we choose. In this example, I'm just going to work with articulator number 1, as that's what we're linked to. So to make this quick and simple, I'll just open the menu on the controller and choose Create Sequence. I'll press the Randomize option to get us going and then accept. So now we have an envelope that has differing curves. These curves, just like an automation clip, will tell the control whether to move up or down. The difference is that the envelope controller is controlled with a keyboard or on the piano roll or step sequencer. What happens is, when we play just the synth, no effect is heard. But when we press a key on the keyboard, or when we draw out a note on the step sequencer or in the piano roll, as if the envelope controller were an instrument, the effect will begin and will continue as long as you press down that key. When you let up on the key or the note ends on the piano roll or step sequencer, the effect will stop. This is a great way to control the effect when playing live or for creating sequences in your music using various linked controls. Remember, you can link to just about anything, so you don't have to use just the volume sliders. I'm using that example here because it's quick and simple, but you could choose to link a flanger's mix level to a synth and then use the envelope controller. That way, whenever you hit the key, the flanger will come through in a sequence. The possibilities are virtually limitless. And as I mentioned, you have separate articulators, or slots, with which to create different sequences, and then you can use the keyboard view window to map out which areas of the keyboard are for which articulators. We discussed a little bit about keyboard mapping in the sampler tutorial. The next controller I want to cover is the keyboard controller. The keyboard controller is inserted as a channel, just like the envelope controller. Its purpose is to use either note velocity or value to affect a linked control. So we'll insert the keyboard controller and then link our volume to the note value. Then, when we're pressing keys on the keyboard using the keyboard controller, the link control will be moved up or down depending on the notes that we hit on the keyboard. The lower the note value, the lower the control moves, and vice versa. If we choose to link to note velocity, the control will be affected by the amount of pressure you put on the keys. This is another great tool for live performances in that you can make quick changes to controls using a MIDI keyboard. We also have the options for release, which determines how quickly the control reverts back to its initial state, as well as a smoothing option, which smooths out the movements. As with before, you can map out which keys affect the control using the testing keyboard area of the plugin. So we've just seen a little bit about linking controls to controllers within FL Studio and how you can use these tools to create dynamic effects and ultimately have greater control over your project and the changes that take place within it. Although we've used the volume controls in this video, remember you can link virtually anything in FL Studio using these options as well as with VST plugins. Linking to created automation is one of the unique features to FL Studio and will make your life much easier when it comes to creating dynamic movements. As mentioned, this is also a great way to control live performances as well. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.